code you have to put in is hormone. And be sure you have a username put in too. Every once in a while, for some reason, somebody won't have a code or a username, and then I don't know who it was that responded. So we've got some people missing, so I wouldn't be sure who to mark present. This is a little bit of a tricky one, this question. But there is one correct answer for this. Okay, I think everybody's answered, and I count 17 people here. 17 answered. So, we got kind of a mixed bag here. So let's go through these, okay? I'm going to start with number 2. The pancreas is both, putting it out the other day, on Wednesday, is both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. So it is, in a way, it's an endocrine organ, at least in part. The thyroid is definitely an endocrine gland. It secretes thyroid hormone. Posterior pituitary also secretes 2 hormones. And then have listed under number 1 and 5 the 2 parts of the adrenal gland. The outer part of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal cortex, and that's an endocrine gland. The deeper parts, the deeper tissue, is called the adrenal medulla, and those cells are thought to be modified sympathetic postganglionic fibers because they secrete epinephrine, which is very similar to norepinephrine, which is secreted by the sympathetic fibers. So the one that's not an endocrine gland would be number 5. The adrenal medulla. So 5 is actually quite. That was a tough one. Okay, let's do another one. This one might be a little easier. Okay, so endocrine glands always secrete their hormones into what? I could have worded this a little better. I could have said endocrine glands always secrete their hormones directly into which of the following. That would have been a better way of stating it. That's what I meant. What do they most directly secrete their hormones into? And I think most of you probably got this right, and I think I'm correct. Correct answer is the bloodstream. Okay. What I should have done is I should have put for a choice a duct, because that's what the exocrine glands release their secretions into, is through a duct, which then empties into a hollow organ. That would have required you to distinguish between those 2 types of glands. Right. So today we're going to look at some of the different classes of hormones that are produced by the endocrine glands of the body, and also the mechanism of action. of some of these hormones. So today we're going to identify the chemical classes to which various hormones belong. We're going to describe two major mechanisms of transport of hormones in the bloodstream. We're going to describe the two major mechanisms of action of hormones. And then we're going to, if we have time, we're going to explain how target cells regulate their sensitivity to the levels of circulating hormones, and then describe how hormones are removed from the bloodstream so they don't continue to produce their effect. So, in order for a hormone to affect its target cells, there are 5 things that have to happen. The first is it has to be synthesized and then released from the endocrine gland. Okay? Then it has to be transported by the bloodstream. After it's transported by the bloodstream, it has to bind to a receptor, either on the surface of the target cell or inside the target cell. It depends on the particular hormone. And then there has to be a mechanism of action which causes a change on the inside of the cell. And there's 2 main ways that this happens. And then it has to be removed from the bloodstream so that the hormone doesn't continue to cause its action after that action is no longer needed. Okay? So these are all parts of all parts of the mechanism by which the endocrine system works. So first I want to go through some different classes of hormones. So hormones are classified into different types based on the type of compound that makes them up. In a similar way that neurotransmitters are also classified into different types. So the first type are the steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are actually derived from cholesterol. Cholesterol is made up of 4 different carbon rings that are attached to each other. And the way our body produces different kinds of steroid hormones, you guys, I don't like talking over people, thanks. So the way our body produces steroid hormones is that our cells add different functional groups to those 4 carbon rings that make up cholesterol and steroid hormones. And so for that reason, cholesterol, which kind of has a bad reputation because it can cause problems if it builds up too high in our blood and clog up our blood vessels, it's actually an essential compound in more than one way. It's needed for the synthesis of steroid hormones, and it's also an integral part of our cell membrane of our cells. So examples of steroid hormones include the sex hormones, such as testosterone, estrogens, and progesterone. Also, some hormones that are produced by our adrenal cortex. There's a whole group of hormones produced by our adrenal cortex called the corticosteroids, which includes cortisol, aldosterone, and dihydroepiandrosterone. Okay? Some of those are similar to the sex hormones. They can also have an effect on the reproductive system and also the immune system. And then, although it's not a steroid, there's a hormone called calcitriol, which regulates calcium. It's a calcium absorption from the intestines, and it's derived from a steroid, and it behaves like one, but it's not actually, technically it's not a steroid hormone. Then, second group are called the monoamines, or the biogenic amines. Monoamines are chemically similar to amino acids in that they have an amino group. An amino group contains a nitrogen and then 3 different hydrogens attached to the nitrogen. And so the monoamines are actually derived from amino acids. They're synthesized from amino acids. And what happens is that the carboxyl end of the amino acid is removed. So you just have an amino group. And so those compounds are called amines. Examples of monoamines include dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter used in the brain, epinephrine, norepinephrine, which can be either a hormone or a neurotransmitter, melatonin, and also thyroid hormone. And then the third class are peptide hormones. Peptides are usually small proteins, which consist of long chains of amino acids. And the number of amino acids they contain can range from 2 to 200, which is really on the small end for a protein. And the peptide hormones include nearly all of the hormones produced by the hypothalamus and most of the hormones of the anterior pituitary, and some of the other hormones produced by the other endocrine glands, like insulin and glucagon, which are produced by the pancreas, parathyroid hormone, which is produced by the parathyroid glands, and many, many others. Okay. All right. Then, once the hormones are synthesized and released, they have to be transported by the blood. And some hormones, like the monoamines and peptides, are hydrophilic, which means they have partial positive and negative charges as part of their structure, just like water has partial negative and positive charges. And so hydrophilic compounds tend to dissolve very easily into water because they're both polar. They're both polar compounds. So monoamines can dissolve directly into the plasma of the blood and just be transported in the blood directly, in the plasma, along with peptides. Peptides can also dissolve directly into the plasma of the blood. And so they're very easily transported. However, steroid hormones, on the other hand, are nonpolar. They're said to be hydrophobic. So they will not dissolve in the plasma because the plasma is made up mostly of water, which is polar. Polar substances don't mix well with nonpolar substances. They don't get along with each other. And so steroid hormones require one other thing for them to be transported. They have to have a carrier protein. And so the way that steroid hormones are transported, the steroid hormone binds to a carrier protein, which is found in the plasma of the blood, and then that enables that carrier protein to dissolve into the plasma. Okay. So the only difference is the steroid hormones and have to bind to a carrier protein in order to dissolve into the blood so it can be transported. Now, once the steroid hormones and its carrier protein get to the location of its target cells, in order to get into the target cells, the steroid hormone has to disassociate from the carrier protein. And there's always a small fraction of steroid hormones that are disassociated from the carrier proteins. Most of the time they stay attached to the carrier proteins. But the only form of the steroid hormones that can get into cells where they produce their effect is if they disassociate, if they break away from the carrier protein. The fraction of the steroid hormones that remains attached to the carrier proteins cannot enter cells because the protein's too big. It's too big to go through the walls of the cells. Okay. And another function, so only the unbound hormone can leave a capillary and enter its target cells. Transport proteins for those steroid hormones also protect the hormones from being broken down by enzymes in the plasma and also the liver. And it also prevents them from being excreted by the kidneys. So if that were to happen, then the levels of those hormones may not be high enough, especially since only a small fraction of those hormones in the blood actually can produce a physiological effect, because most of the time they stay attached to their carrier protein. All right, so once they arrive at their target cells, they then have to have a mechanism by which they change the physiology of the cells that make up an organ. And there are two primary ways that hormones produce by which they produce their effects. The first mechanism is the one that proteins or peptide hormones and amines produce their effect. And this mechanism is called the second messenger mechanism. Okay? So peptide hormones and the amines, like dopamine and serotonin, they're polar compounds. And the middle of the cell membrane of cells is nonpolar. The fatty acid tails of the phospholipid, those are nonpolar. They're not charged. But peptide hormones and amines do have partial charges, so they don't mix well with this nonpolar environment of the middle of the membrane. Consequently, those types of hormones cannot cross the cell membrane very easily at all. In fact, they generally don't cross the cell membrane because polar substances don't mix well with nonpolar substances. So instead, peptide hormones and catecholamines, which are that's a type of amine, they bind to a membrane-bound receptor on the target cell. And once the hormone binds to the receptor in the cell membrane, that activates another protein that's associated with the receptor called a G protein. And the G protein then activates an integral protein in the cell membrane that's an enzyme. Enzyme is a protein that catalyzes a chemical reaction. So the most common form of this second messenger mechanism, once the G protein activates the enzyme, and the first one that was discovered was called adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase is an enzyme that can convert ATP inside the cell to cyclic AMP. And it does this by cutting off two phosphates from ATP to form cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP stands for cyclic adenosine monophosphate. ATP has 3 phosphates, so this enzyme up here cuts 2 phosphates off of ATP to form cyclic AMP, or CAMP. And CAMP then acts as a second messenger. That's called a second messenger. And what it does is it activates inactive enzymes on the inside of the cell. Just like in the blood clotting pathway, thrombin is able to convert profibrin, or fibrinogen into fibrin. Okay, cyclic AMP converts an inactive enzyme into an activated enzyme, and what that does is that just triggers a whole enzyme cascade inside the cell, where the end product of the first reaction activates another protein to produce a second end product, and so on. And that eventually produces a protein that changes the physiology of the cell. Okay? It may activate a protein that can make the cell membrane permeable to a particular substance that can change its physiology. And different target cells, they can produce different effects. So the reason this is called a second messenger mechanism is because the hormone is the first messenger. And it never goes into the cell. It stays on the outside, but it can bind to a receptor. That activates a G protein. The G protein then activates an enzyme that's in the cell membrane. That enzyme then produces a second messenger. That second messenger may be cyclic AMP, or sometimes it's a lipid that's produced by the enzyme. Different hormones use different versions of this second messenger mechanism. But in any event, the binding of the hormone to the receptor causes the production of a second messenger in the inside of the cell, or intracellularly, and that causes a change in the physiology of the cell. Okay? So that's the, and actually, when I learned about this mechanism, and I went to college a long time ago, they didn't even know about this G protein. They didn't even talk about that because it hadn't been discovered yet. They just said, well, the hormone binds to the receptor, and the receptor activates an enzyme. But as it turns out, there's another protein involved that's kind of a link between the receptor and the enzyme. So mechanism is a little more complicated now. There's just one more protein involved that didn't used to be. Okay. So some of the hormones that work by the second messenger mechanism include adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is one of the hormones released by the anterior pituitary. That affects the adrenal glands. And then FSH and LH, those are also anterior pituitary hormones. Those affect the reproductive system. Also, prolactin, PTH, that stimulates prolactin secretion. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, that stimulates the thyroid gland. And then glucagon, which is one of the hormones produced by the pancreas. And then calcitonin, and then catecholamines also work. Now, interestingly, progesterone, which is produced by the ovaries in females, progesterone is actually a steroid, and progesterone mainly produces its action by way of the steroid mechanism, which is the next one we're going to look at. But progesterone also can sometimes stimulate cells by way of the second messenger mechanism. So it can stimulate cells either way. But mainly progesterone is a steroid hormone. Mainly it uses the steroid mechanism. Okay, any questions? Okay, like I said, this enzyme here, different target cells sometimes use different enzymes, and different second messengers are produced. There's another enzyme that produces a lipid called inositol triphosphate, and that once that's produced, then it activates enzymes which cause the physiological change. So it does vary. Okay, then the other mechanism of action is the one that's used by steroid hormones like estrogen and testosterone. And interestingly, the steroid hormone mechanism is also the one that's used by thyroxine, or thyroid hormone. Now, thyroxine is actually an amine. It's derived from amino acids, and it also has iodine as part of its structure. even though thyroxine, which is abbreviated as T3, is an amine, it still works by way of the steroid hormone mechanism. So that's another one of those little exceptions in biology to the general rules. So this example is actually showing the mechanism of action for thyroxine, which is kind of unusual. I kind of wish that they had used a steroid hormone as an example here, but they didn't. But this is the way that most steroid hormones work. Okay, now the thyroid gland releases two different forms of thyroid hormone. One of them is triiodothyronine. You don't need to worry about that name. You don't need to know that. Triiodothyronine has 3 iodide ions attached to it. And so it's abbreviated as T3. 3 stands for the number of iodide ions attached to it. Or excuse me, I'm sorry, I got to turn around. T4 is the most common form of the thyroid hormone. It has 4, T4 has 4 iodides attached to it. T3 only has 3. So majority of the thyroid hormones is in the form of T4, and it also produces smaller amounts of T3. However, the only active form of thyroid hormone is T3, but most of it is produced as T4. Okay, we'll see just a little bit why that is. So T3 and T4 are both transported by binding to a carrier protein, just like a steroid hormone, even though they're not steroid hormones. Okay, and so they're transported as a protein hormone complex in the plasma, and then when they get to the capillaries in the tissue, both T3 and T4 diffuse directly into the target cells. Now, once they get into the target cells, T4 is converted into T3. So because T3 is the only active form of the hormone. So there's an enzyme inside all cells that remove one of the iodide ions from T4 to form T3. Okay? Because T3 is the only active form of it. So what T3 does, T3 diffuses into the nucleus of cells. And this hormone affects almost all cells. And it binds to a receptor in the nucleus. So instead of binding to a receptor in the membrane, steroid hormones diffuse right through the membrane because they're lipid soluble, and they go into the cytoplasm, and then they bind to an intracellular receptor as opposed to a membrane-bound receptor. So once the hormone binds to that receptor in the nucleus, sometimes it'll bind to the receptor in the cytoplasm, sometimes in the nucleus, depends on the hormone. So once that hormone receptor complex forms, it binds to the DNA in the nucleus. Okay, the DNA is the material that forms the control center of the cell. Okay, the nucleus is the control center. DNA contains the instructions for protein synthesis. Okay, so once that hormone receptor complex binds to DNA, what it does, in a nutshell, is it stimulates gene expression. Okay, when a gene is expressed, it's first converted into messenger RNA. Messenger RNA is called a transcript. It's like a copy of the instructions that's in the form of the DNA. And then, so the messenger RNA, once it's synthesized in the nucleus, it moves out into the cytoplasm, and then a ribosome binds to the messenger RNA, and the ribosome translates that messenger RNA, and it synthesizes a a specific protein that is coded for by the messenger RNA. So the hormone receptor complex causes gene expression. The way in which genes are expressed is by way of protein synthesis. And it's a specific protein. That protein then causes a change in the physiology of the cell. Okay. In the case of T3, that hormone speeds up the metabolism of the cell. Okay. So this is how estrogen, it's how progesterone usually stimulates its cells, and also testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, or glucagon. Any of those steroid hormones. This is how it works. So one of the main differences between the steroid mechanism of action and the second messenger mechanism, well, there's several differences. One of them is the location of the receptor. For the second messenger mechanism, the receptor is located in the cell membrane, on the surface of the cell. For the steroid mechanism of action, the receptor is inside the cell. Okay. And then another difference is in the second messenger mechanism, it works by activating proenzymes that are already present in the cell. Whereas the steroid hormone mechanism synthesizes new enzymes by way of gene expression. So they're completely new proteins that act as enzymes. Okay. So steroid mechanism of action is a little slower. It takes a little bit longer because it takes time to synthesize the messenger RNA. It takes some time to translate that on a ribosome into the protein. So it's a little bit slower than the second messenger mechanism. Second messenger mechanism is relatively fast because it doesn't have to synthesize any new proteins. It just activates proteins that are already present. Okay? Any questions? This is actually getting into a little bit of genetics. Actually, we haven't really had the time to talk about genetics much. So I had a couple of slides that I moved up. I had them at the end of this PowerPoint presentation, but I decided to move them up because they just basically summarize these two mechanisms. Okay. So on this diagram compares the two mechanisms side by side. Okay. And it's showing this on the same cell, which is possible because you could have a second messenger protein stimulating a cell along with a steroid hormone. They just bind to different receptors. So up here at the top is the second messenger mechanism, which is the mechanism by which peptides and amines usually stimulate their cells. So this peptide hormone is binding to a receptor. So this brown U-shaped structure is the receptor. That eventually activates a membrane-bound enzyme, and it's actually leaving out part. This little arrow here is where the G protein is located. So this enzyme is activated by way of a G protein that's stimulated by this hormone receptor complex. And then that enzyme produces a second messenger, which is most commonly cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP then activates enzymes in the cell which produce various metabolic effects. Okay. In the case of insulin causes glucose transporters to be inserted into the cell membrane of the cell. And that allows cells to take up glucose more easily. But those glucose transporters are already present in the cell. The cell just has to be signaled to insert them into the membrane. Then down here shows the steroid mechanism of action. This shows a little bit more concise form. So the steroid hormones, they have to bind to a carrier protein to be transported to the target cells. Once they get there, then the hormone has to break free from the transporter, and then it diffuses right through the cell membrane. It goes inside the cell. It then binds to a receptor. That hormone receptor complex then stimulates protein synthesis, and that occurs by way of transcription, which produces messenger RNA. That messenger RNA is then translated into proteins. So this mechanism results in the production of new proteins, which produce various metabolic effects in the cell. Now, just to summarize one more time, I also have a little animation that goes through these same two mechanisms. So, whoops, no, maybe, what happened? Must not have saved my change, I guess. Let me go clear here the end. We'll find it. That's not it. Oh, there it is. Okay, here's the animation. I had moved it. Apparently, I forgot to save it, so it didn't change the location of it. It's still there, though. So this animation shows the mechanism of non-steroid action, which would be the peptide mechanism of action, or the second messenger mechanism. Let me make sure I got my sound turned up here.
The endocrine system is a very important and very involved system within our bodies. It allows our body to communicate over long distances and is a major player in regulating a stable environment, or in other words, preserving homeostasis. This system employs the use of hormones, which are chemicals secreted from glands and enter the bloodstream where they circulate until exerting an effect on a downstream target cell. We are going to be specifically talking about the two types of mechanisms in which hormones exert their effect on target cells. But to start off, here is a brief overview of what hormones are and how they work. There are three basic groups of hormones. 1, amino acid derivatives. 2, peptide hormones. And 3, lipid derivatives or steroid hormones. For amino acid derivatives, these are small molecules and they come from amino acids like tyrosine and tryptophan. One hormone derived from tryptophan is melatonin, a hormone involved in our sleep-wake cycles. You can get tryptophan from foods like turkey, chocolate, or milk. Peptide hormones are made up of a bunch of amino acids. Some examples would be thyroid-stimulating hormone, oxytocin, or prolactin. Lipid derivatives, or steroid hormones, are considered lipophilic, meaning they have an affinity for lipid structures, which we'll take a look at shortly. They circulate in the blood bound to carrier proteins, so they usually last in the circulation longer than other types of hormones. There are two main mechanisms for which a hormone can affect a target cell. The first is by a non-steroid action. This mechanism is employed by an amino acid hormone or peptide hormone. These hormones cannot freely cross the membrane on a target cell, so it first acts by binding a cell surface receptor. There is then an intracellular signaling cascade that occurs in order for the desired effect to take place. There are proteins on the intracellular side of the target cell that are associated with the receptor. Most often, this involves what's called a G protein. This G protein is found next to an enzyme that converts ATP to a molecule called cyclic AMP, or CAM. Something makes this mechanism unique. Cyclic AMP is called a second messenger because it signals a cascade of events that eventually change the enzymatic activity in a cell to cause the target cell response. Examples of hormones that use the cyclic AMP second messenger system include ACTH, calcitonin, epinephrine, glucagon, parathyroid hormone, and ADH. The second mechanism is the steroid action. Because lipid derivative or steroid hormones are lipophilic, they can freely move through the membrane and into the cell. From there, they can either bind to a receptor within the cell, or they can move freely into the nucleus, where the hormone or hormone complex causes a change in gene activity. This then increases transcription and mRNA production, which then leads to an increase in protein production within the cell. Examples of hormones that exert effects via steroid hormone mechanisms are testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, aldosterone, and calcitriol.
Okay, that's kind of a good summary of the two mechanisms. All right, now let's go back to where we left off now. Oops. Okay, now, occasionally an endocrine gland, for one reason or another, may not produce enough of a hormone as it should. Or the opposite can also happen. Sometimes hormones produce too much of a hormone. Okay? Well, our body has a way of making adjustments to abnormally high or abnormally low levels of hormone. And the way it does this is by adjusting the number of receptors. So, if an endocrine gland produces insufficient hormone, then the target cells will respond by increasing the number of receptors for that hormone. That process is called upregulation. Okay. Now, in order for a hormone to produce its effect, you have to have both sufficient amounts of the hormone and sufficient amounts of receptor. If upregulation didn't occur and you didn't have enough of the hormone, then it wouldn't be able to produce enough of an effect to maintain homeostasis. But by increasing the number of receptors, that increases the chance that that low level of hormone can bind to one of the receptors. They're more common, they're easier for the hormone to find. And so that's going to enhance the effect. Okay? The opposite of upregulation is downregulation. Downregulation occurs when an endocrine gland produces too much hormone. Okay? If you have too much hormone, that causes the target cells to decrease the number of receptors. If you decrease the number of receptors, there are fewer receptors for the hormones to bind to, and so that's going to decrease its effect. All right? Now, I think it's important to understand these two mechanisms because one situation where this can come into a play is if someone is, let's say they're a bodybuilder, and so to build up their muscles, they inject testosterone. They inject higher than normal levels of testosterone into their body. Okay. Now, that could cause them to build up larger muscles, and it could allow them to win competitions. However, that can have some harmful effects on their body, like it can harm their liver. All right, so it's not a good idea to do. Plus, if you inject higher than normal levels of testosterone, that's going to cause downregulation of testosterone receptors. Okay, in order to maintain homeostasis, and so if you have fewer receptors, then Well, actually, if you inject testosterone, one problem is that's going to cause your body to produce less testosterone on its own. So if you quit taking it, you're not going to have enough testosterone then. But it can cause the number of receptors to be reduced so that if you quit injecting the steroid, then there's not going to be enough receptors for your own natural testosterone to produce an effect. Okay? So there can be sort of a rebound effect. All right. And upregulation can increase the response to a hormone, to low levels of hormone, to a certain extent, but once levels of the hormone fall too low, upregulation can no longer compensate for that. And that's what happens with people that have type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is caused when your pancreas can no longer produce insulin. It's thought to be a result of an autoimmune disorder where our own immune system destroys the cells that produce insulin. And if your insulin levels fall to really, really, really low levels, then upregulation can't compensate for that. And then your cells aren't going to be able to take up glucose. And if your cells can't take up enough glucose, then they essentially start starving. So that's basically what happens. But you can treat type 1 insulin with insulin injections. But you have to be careful because if you give too high levels, it can cause downregulation. That can cause insulin insensitivity. So it's where it's important to regulate insulin levels. So that's why now they have insulin pumps. Insulin pumps can deliver that insulin and maintain more constant blood levels of glucose. Because if your blood glucose levels get too high, that can cause problems in all kinds of organs, your eyes, your heart, your brain, cause circulation problems in the legs, so that circulation can decrease in your legs, and it can also prevent cells of the immune system from squeezing through the walls of capillaries and getting into a site of infection. So if a diabetic does get an infection, let's say on their foot, their body may not be able to fight that off as well, and so it could cause serious infections that sometimes can only be treated through amputation. So amputation is sometimes something that has to be done to keep the infections from spreading from the rest of their body and killing them. All right, we're about out of time, so this is probably a good place to stop. So next week we're going to continue to talk about the endocrine system. Just one heads up, I'm not sure if and when this is going to happen. I'm expecting a call from a doctor's office in Sioux Falls. They want me to come in for a procedure, and depending on when they can do that, I may or may not miss class next week. So even if we do miss one day, I think we still have time to get through chapter 17.